Under the shadow of England. Their son, though regarded through Scotland, enjoyed little freedom from the economically and politically powerful English. Repeatedly, England frustrated Scotland's attempts for independence. By the end of the 13th century, however, certain events brought Scottish discontent to a boil, and the nation exploded into open rebellion against its English overlords. The road to independence was to be as long as it was bloody, and before freedom was theirs, the cold, wet moors of Scotland would be littered with the bodies of her bravest sons. Standing between the Scots and independence was the tough, ruthless English king, Edward I, who had ruled since 1272 and viewed Scotland as a vassal state. Handsome and bright, yet easily angered and intolerant of opposition, Edward provoked the issue of Scottish independence in 1294, when he commanded King John of Scotland to supply him with troops with which to wage war with France. Scotland held no quarrel with the French, and deeply resented the English king's presumption that its overseas interests matched those of England. The Scots rebuffed Edward I, and then ensured a confrontation by defiantly siding with England's enemy, France. Edward's response was swift. In 17 short days, he stormed and sacked Berwick, defeated the Scottish army at Dunbar, and forced a humiliated King John to sue for peace. King Edward treated the Scots not as foreign enemies, but as rebels in arms. His army rounded up Scottish nobles and executed them on the spot. Far from extinguishing the fires of rebellion, however, Edward's barbarous actions only fanned the flames. A year later, the resilient Scots again rose up. This time under forces led by William Wallace, a capable Scottish general. And this time the Scots stunned the English with a bloody victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. A chronicle written by an Augustan monk of the time told the bloody story from the English perspective.
The Scots allowed as many of the English to cross the bridge as they could hope to overcome, and then, having blocked the bridge, they slaughtered all those who had crossed, amongst whom perished the treasurer of England, Hugh de Cressingham, of whose skin William Wallace caused a broad strip to be torn from the head to heel, to therewith make a baldric of his sword. The Earl of Warren escaped with great difficulty and a small following. So hotly did the enemy pursue them.
Upon hearing of the defeat of his army at Stirling Bridge, the king himself marched north at the head of a strong army, bent on snuffing out the rebellious Scots once and for all. Unknown to the Scots, the army that filed north to meet them carried a new and brutally effective weapon, the longbow. With the help of these longbowmen, King Edward dealt the Scots a crippling blow at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. On the field of battle, a blizzard of arrows hissed overhead and thudded into the ranks of the unprotected Scots. Many an English bowman, each with a complement of a dozen arrows, boasted that he carried 12 Scots' lives at his girdle. The longbow proved to be the most lethal weapon on the field of battle for over 300 years. After Falkirk, Edward continued to exact revenge against the rebellious Scots by continuing the military subjugation of Scotland. By 1305, a complete English victory seemed a certainty when King Edward's men captured the Scottish leader, William Wallace. All seemed lost for the Scots, and indeed Wallace's capture would have spelled the end of their hopes for independence were it not for the death of King Edward from old age and the nearly miraculous determination of another Scot, Robert Bruce. Robert Bruce alone galvanized the Scottish people and confronted defeat with stout heart and steel sword. Later generations of Scots remembered him with awe simply as the Bruce. The fate of Scotland lay in this man's hands. The year was 1314, and the turning point for Scottish independence was about to come at the bloody Battle of Bannockburn. In medieval Britain, the power was centered in great fortified castles that dotted the countryside. Around these strongholds, occupied by men of wealth and nobility, grew the small villages and hamlets of the feudal economy. Those who controlled the castles of Scotland also controlled Scotland, a fact not lost on the rising star of Scottish independence, Robert Bruce. Since the death of King Edward I in 1307, Bruce had ruthlessly consolidated his power, first by assassinating his rival in cold blood in church, and then by methodically sacking both English-held castles and those held by his Scottish rivals. The new King of England, Edward II, lacked both the military knowledge and the leadership skills of his father, and soon control of Scotland began to slip away. By 1314, only one Scottish castle remained in English hands, Stirling. Towering above the central plain of Middle Scotland, its strategic importance was rivaled only by its symbolism as the last bastion of English might. Both Robert Bruce and Edward II knew that the outcome of all these long years of war and bloodshed would hinge on what would happen on the grounds outside Stirling Castle. Hearing that Stirling would surrender by midsummer of 1314, if not reinforced, Edward rode north with a strong army to defend it. The core of the king's army consisted of 3,000 heavily armored cavalry. These were mostly knights who wore iron helmets and coats of chainmail that were supplemented by plate armor. Many carried battle axes and heavy maces that would render an enemy's chainmail useless. The bulk of the English force consisted of 20,000 infantrymen, mostly bowmen, dressed simply in padded quilted jackets of canvas or leather. Some were also protected by iron mail and simple iron helmets. In contrast to the English, the Scottish army put little importance on mounted cavalry, relying instead on its well-armed infantry. Bearing long pikes, 14-foot sharpened spears, dense masses of Scottish pikemen formed units known as skiltrons, the Scottish term that meant moving thickets. Marching shoulder to shoulder in a dense forest of pointed spears, each skiltron posed a deadly threat to attacking cavalry, who could not penetrate their ranks lest they or their horses become impaled. But the spears of these tightly packed ranks of pikemen also formed the basis of their weakness. Bunched together, they were highly vulnerable to English arrows, a point made all too well at the Battle of Falkirk. Also, the dense units of spearmen moved slowly and with difficulty, a potential disadvantage in battle. Aware of this, Robert Bruce ordered the skiltron units to drill in moving with efficiency and speed as they waited for the English to arrive. These dress rehearsals would pay off handsomely in the upcoming confrontation. When the king's army arrived at Stirling on June 23, 1314, with an army roughly twice the size of their opposition, Robert Bruce and his well-practiced Scottish army lay in wait, eager for the taste of English blood. Robert Bruce also knew the land well. Stirling was surrounded by a low floodplain, or carse, which was wet, marshy, and quite unsuitable for cavalry. An old Roman road followed the line of slightly higher dry ground to the castle. Several miles south of the castle, the road crossed a narrow stream known as the Bannockburn. Robert Bruce assumed that King Edward, burdened with a large baggage train, would seek to advance along the road, so he deployed his army among the trees of an area known as the New Park, just north of where the road crossed the stream. Pots, or pitfall traps, were dug across the front of the position as a defensive measure. On his arrival, Edward sent sorties out to assess his enemy's strength. One reconnaissance party, led by Sir Humphrey de Bohun, advanced straight up the road and across the Bannockburn. Much to his surprise, he came face to face with Robert Bruce himself. The King of the Scots had ridden out alone to survey the land. De Bohun acted at once, charging toward Bruce with lance leveled. Had Bruce been equally armed, he would have ridden headlong to the challenge. But instead, he waited quietly until the English knight was almost upon him, then quickly moved his horse aside and struck de Bohun dead with a single shattering blow from his battle axe. The second English reconnaissance party under Sir Robert de Clifford had no better luck meeting a regiment of Scottish spearmen while crossing the river to the east. Not noted for his military wisdom, King Edward then made a fatal error. He rejected plans for a frontal assault, though he outnumbered his enemy, and instead ordered his troops to flank the Scots on the east across the route taken by Robert de Clifford. That night, the entire English army ponderously swung to its right and crossed the Bannockburn. The king had failed to notice that what had proved adequate dry ground for a small sortie of cavalry was entirely inadequate for a mass of 20,000 men. In an attempt to find dry land, the English army spread farther towards the east and into the midst of a great bog. Mired in the wetlands, with a large river at their backs and another stream on their flank, the English awaited the light of dawn. They were in ankle deep in mud and water. Unbeknownst to them, and walked directly into a trap. But as dawn came, the English realized this would be no chivalrous encounter, but a muddy, brutal killing match in which no prisoners were taken, and the carnage was extreme. Robert Bruce, the leader of the Scottish forces, watched the English like a spider watching the approach of a fly into his web. As the English moved to the east in an attempt to flank the Scots, Bruce swung his infantry into a line of 3 groups of spearmen. Behind this forbidding line, commanded by his lieutenants, Bruce positioned another force of spearmen as a reserve, which he commanded himself. And as additional reserves, he stationed a poorly armed and little disciplined division of Scottish Highlanders known as the Gillies in the woods of the New Park. Robert Bruce positioned his 500 light horsemen well out on his left flank. The English, on the other hand, were poorly organized, in part because of the uncomfortable night spent in the midst of a bog. At their front were the English cavalry squadrons. Behind those, the infantry were massed, hemmed in between the Bannockburn and the River Forth. Again, Robert Bruce showed his superior tactical abilities when he struck first, an unconventional strategy for masked spearmen who usually fought defensively. In the early morning light, the forest of lethal Scottish infantry and their spears swept down the hill straight toward the massed English. When they met, fierce fighting ensued as waves of English knights threw themselves at the Scottish units, trying in vain to break holes in their line. But the resolute Scots held their ground, aiming their spears at the unprotected horses of the charging knights. Whenever a knight fell or jumped free from his speared horse, the Scots swarmed atop him and killed him with sword and dagger. Seeing that the wide English front line was about to flank his line on the left, Robert Bruce brought his reserve spearmen in for support. Stuck behind their cavalry, the English infantry was rendered useless. In a vain attempt to launch arrows over the heads of the knights, the English bowmen ended up shooting many of their own troops. One advance group of archers, however, managed to run out well to the right of their column and gain a clear line of fire. Seeing his vulnerability, Robert Bruce again acted quickly, sending his light horsemen in to attack the archers. Unprotected by spearmen of their own, the English archers fled in the face of the Scottish cavalry charge. The English were thus robbed of their greatest weapon against the massed Scottish spearmen, the arrow. By that time, the battle had raged for an hour, and Robert Bruce knew that his infantry had grown tired. With perfect timing, he played his ace card and called upon the gillies hidden in the trees. With a single shouted command from Robert Bruce, a flood of reserves broke from the woods and charged toward the battle at a full run. Untrained and disorganized, these same men had been rejected as spearmen, but their presence on the field at that time turned the course of the battle. The appearance of these fresh reserves shattered the will of the embattled knights. Much to their horror, the English found themselves pushed back deeper toward the bogs. Again, the writing of the Augustan monk recalls the nightmare scene.
In the leading division were killed the Earl of Gloucester, Sir John Cummings, Sir Pagan de Tiptoft, Sir Edmund de Morley, and many other nobles, besides foot soldiers, who fell in great numbers. Another calamity which befell the English was that whereas earlier they had crossed a great ditch called Bannockburn into which the tide flows, when they tried to recross it in confusion, many of the nobles fell back with their horses in the crush, while others escaped with great difficulty, and many could not extricate themselves from the ditch. Thus was Bannockburn spoken about for many years in English throats.
During medieval times, many men lost their lives on the battlefield, but the real killing commenced after the battle ended, as fleeing soldiers were hunted down by the victorious army. Such was the case at Bannockburn, and the killing continued until nightfall. Few English escaped the Scottish wrath. One who did was King Edward, who eluded his Scottish victors and rode to safety. Stirling Castle had fallen to the Scots. With this monumental victory against overwhelming odds, Robert Bruce was hailed by all as King of the Scots. The Battle of Bannockburn, the culmination of a long and bloody war, firmly established Scottish independence from England. No longer would Scotland be a feudal servant of the English overlords. King Bruce's legacy still thunders across the ages, his voice ringing clear in the Declaration of Arbroath. For so long as 100 men remain alive, we shall never, under any condition, submit to the domination of the English. It is not for glory, or riches, or honors that we fight, but only for liberty, which no good man will consent to lose, but with his life.